The moment George sneered those venomous words, "Then never come back, sign the divorce papers and leave," I knew my life was about to change forever. I stood in the opulent living room of the house we shared, a place that never truly felt like home. The walls, once symbols of security, now seemed to close in on me, suffocating me with memories of a marriage that had been nothing but a charade. Reflecting on the years spent with George, I realized how he had skillfully donned a mask of perfection in public, while in private, he was a tyrant. The duality of his character was so profound that it left me questioning my own sanity. George, the charming and successful trader, admired by all, was a facade. The real George was a man who relished in belittling me, his wife, behind closed doors. Our relationship hadn't always been this way. In college, George was the epitome of kindness, his patience seemingly boundless. He wooed me with his gentle demeanor, and before I knew it, I was entranced, agreeing to marry him. It was only after the vows were exchanged that his true nature surfaced, like a predator revealing itself. I became his prey, trapped in a web of emotional abuse and manipulation. Each day was a battle, a struggle to appease a man who seemed impossible to please. His words were like daggers, each one striking deeper than the last. "Hey, what's with that bland food?" he would bark. My apologies and attempts at explanation were met with scorn. "No excuses," he'd snap back. My spirit withered under his constant criticism. I longed to reach out, to share my pain with friends, but George, ever the controller, severed those ties too. He convinced them I was the problem, turning my cries for help into whispers lost in the wind. I once dared to ask George to let me visit my mother's grave. His response was a cold, heartless refusal, stripping away the last shred of humanity I thought he possessed. "Why would you show your face to someone who's already gone?" he scoffed, his eyes not leaving the financial newspaper he was reading. The realization that I was nothing more than an object to him was my breaking point. I demanded a divorce, a plea I thought he would dismiss. Instead, he flung the divorce papers at me with a malicious glee. "Sign these and leave," he commanded. In that moment, I felt a surge of freedom. I signed the papers without a second thought, severing the chains that bound me to George. The divorce was finalized with a swift brutality that mirrored our entire relationship. Leaving the house that had been my prison, I embarked on a journey back to my mother's home, the only place I hoped to find some solace. Little did I know that this decision would lead me to a reunion that would change my life even more dramatically. The dilapidated state of my mother's house was a stark contrast to the life of luxury I had just left. Standing before it, memories of a happier time flooded back. But the nostalgia was interrupted by a sudden thud behind me. Turning around, I saw an elderly man in a gray suit, a face from the past, yet unfamiliar. "Are you alive?" he exclaimed, rushing towards me with an urgency that left me baffled. Before I could react, he embraced me, his tears soaking my shoulder. "I heard the news of your death. I couldn't sit still. I finally found you," he sobbed, his voice laden with a lifetime of regret and longing. His embrace, though unexpected, carried the warmth and familiarity of a long-lost connection. "Could it be, Dad?" I whispered, a mixture of hope and disbelief in my voice. He pulled back, his tear-streaked face searching mine for recognition. "Elizabeth? Are you Elizabeth?" he asked, his voice trembling. In that embrace, I felt the echoes of my childhood, the faint memories of a father's love that had been absent for so long. His name was Matthew, my father, who had vanished from my life when I was just a child. As we reconnected, the pieces of my past began to fall into place. Matthew's story unfolded, revealing a man torn away from his family by circumstances beyond his control. He spoke of a love for my mother that never waned, a love that was cut short by forces that pulled him away, leaving a void in both our lives. Sitting in the dusty living room of my childhood home, I shared with him the agonizing years I spent with George. My father listened, his expression a mix of sorrow and simmering anger. "I should have been there for you," he said, his voice heavy with guilt. As I recounted the cruelty and manipulation I endured, Matthew's demeanor shifted from sorrow to resolve. "We can't let him get away with this," he declared, his eyes now reflecting a determination that mirrored my own. It was then that we decided to take action, to seek justice and retribution for the years of suffering I endured at the hands of George. Our plan was simple yet bold. We would gather evidence of George's abuse, both physical and emotional, and expose him for the monster he was. Matthew, with his newfound resolve, was ready to stand by my side, to fight the battle that we both knew was long overdue. As the sun set on my first day back in my childhood home, I felt a sense of purpose that had been missing for far too long. With my father by my side, I was ready to face my past and reclaim my future. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. George would no longer control my life. It was time for retribution, and I was ready to fight. The morning sun cast a new light on the old house, bringing with it a sense of hope and determination. As Matthew and I sat at the kitchen table, laden with years of dust and memories, we began to devise our plan of action. Matthew was not just a forgotten father trying to make amends. He had resources and connections that could prove invaluable. "Elizabeth, we need evidence. Solid, indisputable evidence of George's abuse," Matthew said, his voice firm, yet tinged with a father's concern. I nodded, feeling a surge of empowerment. For years, I had documented George's abuse in secret, a diary of my pain hidden in the depths of my personal belongings. Now it was time to bring it into the light. As I shared my diary entries with Matthew, his face darkened with each word. The extent of my suffering, laid bare in those pages, fueled a fire within him. "We'll need more than this," he stated resolutely. "Do you have anything else? Any recordings or messages?" "Yes," I replied, a sense of relief washing over me. I had recorded some of George's tirades, his venomous words captured in the secrecy of my pocket. It was a risky move, but one driven by a desperate need for validation, for proof that I was not the one at fault. Matthew listened to the recordings, his expression a mix of pain and anger. "This is good, Elizabeth. This is what we need to bring him down," he said, his voice steady but his eyes betraying a storm of emotions. Our conversation turned to George's professional life, a facade of success and respectability. "He's involved in some shady dealings at his company," I revealed. "I've overheard conversations, seen documents. He's embezzling funds." Matthew's eyes narrowed. "We can use this. It's time George faces the consequences of his actions, both personal and professional." The resolve in his voice was unwavering, a stark contrast to the man who had once left us behind. The next step in our plan required reaching out to an unexpected ally, my ex-father-in-law, Mr. Patterson. I hesitated, the thought of involving George's parents in our plan weighing heavily on me. They had always been kind, and I feared dragging them into this sordid affair. "Elizabeth, we need all the help we can get," Matthew urged. "If they know the truth, they might support us." Gathering my courage, I called Mr. Patterson, inviting him over under the guise of catching up. When he arrived, the surprise on his face was evident. "Elizabeth, it's been so long. You look different," he said, a hint of concern in his voice. "Mr. Patterson, there's something you need to know about George," I began, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. I recounted the years of abuse, the emotional scars that still lingered. Mr. Patterson listened, his expression shifting from shock to anger. "I had no idea. How could George do this?" he exclaimed, his voice shaking with emotion. "And the embezzlement. This is unacceptable. We need to act." With Mr. Patterson on our side, our plan gained momentum. We pooled our resources, gathering more evidence against George. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, painting a picture of a man who had deceived everyone around him. As we sat together, plotting our next move, I felt a sense of camaraderie, a bond formed through shared adversity. Together we were stronger, united in our quest for justice. The stage was set for a confrontation that would bring George's reign of terror to an end. The time for retribution was at hand, and we were ready to strike. The day of reckoning arrived. We had arranged to meet George at a neutral location, a quiet cafe where there would be witnesses to prevent any outburst from him. Mr. Patterson, Matthew, and I sat at a corner table, awaiting George's arrival with a mix of anticipation and anxiety. George walked in, his arrogance filling the room. Spotting us, he approached with a sneer. "What is this? An intervention?" he mocked, his voice dripping with disdain. "Sit down, George. We need to talk," Mr. Patterson said, his voice stern, devoid of the warmth he once showed his son. George's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Talk about what? Elizabeth, if this is about more money, you can forget it." "It's not about money, George," I said, my voice calm but firm. "It's about your actions, the abuse and the theft." George laughed, a cold, harsh sound. Abuse, Elizabeth, you always were dramatic, and theft, you're delusional. I held his gaze, my resolve unwavering. No, George, I'm not delusional. We have proof. I slid the folder containing the diary entries and recordings across the table. His face paled as he glanced through the documents, his facade beginning to crack. This is nonsense, he spat, but his voice lacked conviction. Matthew leaned forward, his eyes hard. We also know about the embezzlement, George. You've been stealing from your company. George's composure shattered. You can't prove anything? He hissed. Mr. Patterson interjected. We can and we will. I can't believe I raised a son who could do such things. The confrontation escalated, with George alternating between denial and bluster. But the evidence was irrefutable. His mask of respectability had slipped, revealing the monster beneath. As we left the cafe, George's parting words were a venomous threat. You'll regret this, he snarled. But we walked away, united and stronger for having faced him. The path to justice was clear, and George's reign of terror was coming to an end. The aftermath of the confrontation was a whirlwind of activity. With the evidence in hand, we approached George's company with the allegations of embezzlement. The company acted swiftly, launching an internal investigation that corroborated our claims. George was fired, his career in ruins. Simultaneously, I pursued legal action for alimony and damages for the years of abuse. The court proceedings were grueling, but I stood my ground, bolstered by the support of Matthew and Mr. Patterson. The diary and recordings played a crucial role, painting a vivid picture of the life I had endured with George. In the end, justice was served. The court ruled in my favor, granting a substantial settlement that would secure my financial independence. George, now a pariah, faced not only the loss of his career, but also the scorn of those he had deceived. The victory was bittersweet. While I had won my freedom and vindication, the years lost to George's abuse could never be reclaimed. Yet there was a sense of closure, a feeling that a chapter of my life had been conclusively closed. With the legal battles behind me, I turned my focus to rebuilding my life. Matthew and I, now reconciled, decided to renovate my mother's house, transforming it into a home filled with love and memories, free from the shadows of the past. The journey had been long and fraught with pain, but I emerged stronger, with a newfound sense of self and purpose. The scars of the past would always be a part of me, but they no longer defined me. I was ready to start anew, to live a life of my own choosing, unencumbered by the specter of George. The future was mine to shape, and I embraced it with open arms and a hopeful heart. In the tranquil setting of the renovated house, now a haven of peace and new beginnings, I sat with Matthew on the porch, reflecting on our journey. The evening air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers, a testament to the new life we had cultivated. Elizabeth, do you ever regret it? Confronting George, exposing him? Matthew asked, his voice tinged with both curiosity and concern. I paused, considering his question. No, Dad, I don't regret it. It was difficult, but it needed to be done. For too long, I let him control my life, my happiness. No more, I replied, my voice firm, echoing the resolve I felt inside. Matthew nodded, a look of pride crossing his face. You're strong, Elizabeth, stronger than you ever realized. The conversation shifted to our future plans. I expressed a desire to use my experience to help others who might be suffering in silence. I want to be a voice for those who feel voiceless, to help them find the strength to seek help, I said, my determination clear. Matthew supported my ambition, offering to help in any way he could. Let's do it together, Elizabeth. Let's make a difference. Our plans were interrupted by an unexpected visitor, Mr. Patterson. He arrived with a somber expression, requesting a private word with me. We stepped aside, and he shared news that sent a chill down my spine. Elizabeth, it's about George, he began, his voice heavy. He's spiraling out of control. After losing his job and reputation, he's been seen wandering the streets, shouting your name, blaming you for his downfall. A mix of emotions surged within me, fear, pity, and a lingering anger. I'm sorry to hear that, Mr. Patterson, but he brought this upon himself. His actions, his choices led him here. I responded, my heart heavy, but my resolve unwavering. Mr. Patterson nodded, understanding my stance. I know, Elizabeth. I just thought you should be aware. We're handling it, trying to get him the help he needs. As Mr. Patterson left, I stood there, a sense of finality washing over me. George's downfall was his own doing, a consequence of his actions and choices. While I hoped he would find some semblance of peace, I knew my path lay elsewhere. Turning back to Matthew, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. Our experiences had brought us closer, and together we were embarking on a new chapter, one filled with hope and the promise of making a difference. In the quiet of the evening, as the sun set on the horizon, I realized that this journey had not only been about revenge or justice. It had been a journey of self-discovery, of finding my voice and reclaiming my life. The future was uncertain, but it was mine to shape, and I stepped into it with a heart full of hope and a spirit unbroken.